Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Nikhil Dabade. I'm the Senior Product Manager for AWS Amplify. And today I'll be talking about bringing AIML to your mobile and web apps. So let's get started. Now, on a high level, I just wanted to touch on what we will be covering throughout this webinar. And to go through the flow, we'll start with what is AIML and why am I bringing that first bullet up when we already know that we're going to talk about AIML. We'll deep dive into that particular topic, but there is a slight distinction between AI and ML, and those terms are often interchangeably used. So we'll touch on that. What's the slight distinction? Then we will move on to what is AWS Amplify. Then we'll get our hands on demo for building a web app with AI ML capabilities using AWS Amplify. Once we are done building the web app, we'll test it locally, and then we'll deploy and host the web app using one of two options that we have. And I'll walk you through both of them. But we'll use AWS Amplify CLI and host our web app using an S3 bucket and CloudFront. And the other option is we'll have AWS Amplify Console host our web app. In the end, I have the resources to share all of the points that I have mentioned in the webinar, and we'll have corresponding links to wherever deep dive is needed shared across it. So even if you, at some point in webinar, you feel that, oh, I needed more information on this, you can go back to those resources and go through all of those instructions. And then in the end, of course, we'll do the Q&A. So let's start with the first point. So what is AIML? Now, we often hear these two terms being interchangeably used or completely distinctively used depending on who's talking about these. But the reason that I bring this up is there is a difference between them. So what is AI when you say, and what is the difference as compared to ML? So the way I prefer to think about it is AI services allow you to simulate natural intelligence to solve some complex problem. So essentially it's a decision making. You're saying, give me a solution to something, a complex problem such as translate text from one language to another. Maybe the source language is English and the target language is Spanish. That's one use case. The other use case could be identify the entities in an image. What do you see when you look at an image? There might be some objects, there might be a bicycle, there might be a mountain. So entity recognition is one of the AI services problem. The second aspect is machine learning. So machine learning is a system that allows you to learn stuff from this data. So when you're saying that, okay, I have an image recognition system, and now I want the image recognition system to learn new types of objects, or I already have a sample data, large sample data of a new type of object. Maybe you're building a product. Maybe you're building a new type of car, and you want that car to be identified immediately when you ask your AI services. So how do you build that? You learn new stuff from those models, and the whole system that allows you to learn from the data that you provide is your machine learning. So that's the key distinction between those two. AI is your decision making, and ML is learning from the data that you give it. And then, of course, the output of an ML service is one of the outputs is a model, and those models are nothing but what AI services use, using which you can call inferences of them or make the decision. Moving on. So what is AWS Amplify? So I think an easier way to talk about AWS Amplify is just to look at the higher level 10,000 feet, and then we'll peel layers as we go along so that you can see how those pieces come together. So in a really simplistic manner, AWS Amplify is a suite of services and tools that you can use to build scalable, cloud-powered mobile and web apps. Now, so when I say mobile and web apps, your mobile is your native apps, such as your iOS and Android apps, and your web apps are apps that can run inside a browser, either on a device or on a web or on your desktop. So what does AWS Amplify comprise of when I say it's a suite of services and tools? A simplistic way to think about this is if you look at the picture on the right-hand side in this slide, you have a framework component on the top, then you have developer tools on the right-hand side bottom, and then on the left side, you have cloud services, and in the middle, you have CLI. So to just demystify what is AWS Amplify, you just think of it in two terms, saying one bucket is your framework, and the other bucket is your developer tools. What does Amplify Framework comprise? In simplistic terms, it's three things. It's a command line interface that you use to set up and manage your backend. You have a set of client libraries that you use inside your mobile or web applications. So these are front-end libraries that you use to make call and connect and talk to your backend. And then we have a beautiful UI component library. These are pre-built components. For example, if you are using JavaScript framework like React or Angular or Ionic, we do build pre-built UI components that are already powered with cloud capability. Now, what does that mean? For example, if you're building an app and you want to add authentication to your app. So in order to build authentication, you would need to add text boxes saying username, password, maybe a link that says forgot password, or even links to say sign in, sign up. A typical authentication page can consume some time to build it. But what if you had a UI component that already does all of that for you? You can customize that page and it's already wired up to the cloud services that will enable the authentication. So in case of Amplify, the underlying service would be Cognito. So all you do is just with 2 lines of code, you can add a simple authenticator to your mobile application. So that's the framework piece. So 3 things: CLI, library, UI component. Then you have the developer tool. Developer tools are of 2 types. The first piece that Amplify Framework we were talking about was the develop piece. So you want to develop an app. Now there's the second piece of any app development lifecycle, which is the deploy piece. So you built your app, now you want to deploy or host it if it's a web app. So we have the AWS Amplify Console for it. What is it? It's a CI/CD and hosting service. So it follows a GitHub workflow. So essentially, if you have a control version like GitHub, GitLab, it supports a number of other version control systems. You can connect those, and AWS Amplify Console takes place of the build, host, and deploy piece of your web applications. So currently it supports only web applications. And then the second piece in the developer piece is the device farm. So device farm is nothing but as the name suggests, it's a farm of real devices. So let's say you have an app, you're ready, you feel confident that you want to release it. If you're releasing, let's say, an iOS and Android app, it's always good to run it on real devices, because real devices will give you the actual test results that your customers out there in the wild are going to use. You can use simulators, but simulators can have certain restrictions, like they don't have Bluetooth. You may not be able to mock location data on those. So it comes on with its own set of restrictions. So Device Farm provides you a host of real devices which are unmodified. And when I say unmodified, these are unrooted devices. They are supposed to be retail devices that you go walk into a store and buy them and then download the app and start using them. So that's Device Farm. So now let's start looking at Amplify Framework. And we'll, for the purpose of this webinar, when we build our AIML app, we'll be using the Amplify Framework. So we'll use the CLI and the client libraries to set up the backend and then make calls to the backend. And then once we're done building that, we'll use the console to deploy our app. So let's look at each one of those components now. Before we start looking at each one of those components in the Amplify framework, it just helps to set context. What is Amplify framework? Because we made those 2 distinctions into buckets. So on a high level, what is Amplify framework? So Amplify framework, as we saw those 3 components, is a 100% open source, opinionated, category-based client framework, which you can use to build full stack serverless app. Now, there's a lot of words in there. So let's break it down and go one by one. Open source, all the GitHub, all the Amplify framework libraries, including the CLI, JavaScript libraries, the iOS, Android SDKs, everything is hosted on GitHub. We don't have any proprietary code that we're running as of Amplify framework. It all operates out there on GitHub. And we'll go through the links and I'll show you, where can you browse for more material, how can you raise issues, how can you contribute back. And opinionated is we take a stance on saying what are the best practices out there as far as library setting up backend. An example could be, let's say you want to create an S3 bucket for your storage to store images. So what is the default permission levels that you should have on that bucket? What is the best practice on it? And so we take certain opinionated stances on the library and on the backend when you're creating them. So that's the first piece of it. Second, it follows a declarative programming model with best practices built in. So I already talked about the best practices built in, and declarative serves the purpose that you do not have to then manually go on and edit everything. You can use a declarative style to manage your libraries and your CLI. And if all of these opinionated and open source solutions don't work for you, you always have an option to use the escape hatches within the Amplify framework. What are the escape hatches? Let's say you started using storage, for example, on Amplify framework, and you found a use case that it's really not serving your purpose, although we've really received good feedback so far from customers. But there's always a use case out there which may not be fitting the opinionated way. In that case, you can use the lower level SDKs offered by the services and still go and use that functionality if it's not included in the Amplify framework. So you're not tied in to the framework if you start using it, or it's not a one-way door. You can always have the Amplify framework and have the escape hatches as well. So let's look at the components of Amplify framework now that we have covered the 10,000 feet overview of Amplify framework. So as we said, we'll go to the components, which are the CLI and the libraries. But the question comes, what are these components serving? When you're saying, okay, you can set up the backend and libraries, what are you trying to achieve? So the capabilities of Amplify are nothing but categories. What are categories? They're use case-based logical buckets. That's how I would simplify it. What are the use case-based common scenarios? Let's say you're trying to build a new mobile or web applications. What are the most common use cases you want to try and add to your application? I can think of data. Most applications would have some form of data that they have stored in the cloud or have locally. The other is authentication and authorization. You want your correct users to log in, or users that are authenticated to access the right data. And then you need authorization to have a correct group of users with proper permissions accessing the data that's only accessible to them. So that's your auth, which is auth N, and auth Z, which is authentication and authorization. And the third is analytics. So if you look at any app, you most likely will have these three core components, which is your data, which is the API category inside this, if you see the second tile on the left side. Then you have your authentication, which is the third tile. And then you have your analytics, because you want to measure your app performance, how your users are behaving. You want to maybe record events and then deploy incremental changes. So you need some form of analytics. Today we support 9 categories, and of course you always have escape hatches, and you can expand those. It's not just restricted to those. The one main category that's not visible here is predictions category, and I've intentionally not brought it here, added it to this slide, because I want us to talk more on that, and that's the focus of the webinar. So I'll be giving dedicated time to that. But predictions is the category that we use for AI/ML use cases when you want to build an app using Amplify framework. So let's go deeper. So what is the Amplify framework? As I earlier covered, it's a command line interface that you use to create and manage your backend. CLI also has its own categories. So when you're saying that, okay, maybe I want to have a storage. So storage is a category inside CLI. And those categories most closely match to the Amplify framework capabilities that I mentioned, because you need the backend for those capabilities. So we'll go over the categories of those, but they really closely match to what the Amplify framework supports as capabilities. Then we have support for multiple environments. What does that mean? That means you may have you're trying to use the CLI. Let's say you have a dev environment. Let's say you have another test environment, and you have multiple teams collaborating on that. So CLI enables a Git-based workflow to create new environments and have the backend be shared across those environments, or have distinct environments and serving distinct backends. So you have the ability to do that. And then the next piece is GraphQL Transform. This is a very powerful tool. So what is GraphQL Transform? GraphQL Transform provides a high-level abstraction for you to create your AWS backends. Now, yes, it's an abstraction, but what does that really mean? So let me give you an example. An example could be, let's say you have an app that you have some data requirements for. So you're saying, okay, I have an app that is a blog that serves to users who want to write blog. So you may have an application data model where you say, okay, here's a blog post, here's an ID for the blog post, here's comments for those. So you have an application data model. Now, how do you go about creating the backend for that? Do you go in and create tables manually? Do you use Dynamo? Do you use RDS? What do you do? So what this does is GraphQL Transform works backwards from a schema definition. So it says, give me a schema that represents your application's data model, and then it converts those schema, that is a GraphQL schema written in a GraphQL schema definition language, and then creates the corresponding backend AWS CloudFormation templates. So the CLI underneath the covers uses CloudFormation. So and the good thing about that is you can modify those CloudFormation to suit your needs if what the CLI is giving you is not serving your purpose. What could be a use case like that? We expect most use cases to be covered and you should not be needing to touch the CloudFormation. But as I said, every use case is unique and we want to serve every customer in that sense. So let's say you have an existing resource, storage, S3 bucket that you already want to include, and the CLI that you are using you already created a storage bucket. So if you want to use an existing resource, you can go to the CloudFormation template and update it with your existing resource configuration. And that way you can use an existing AWS resource as well. And then you have the last piece is the plugins. The CLI is a pluggable framework. So you can have plugins that you write for the CLI. We already have a few open source contributions where customers have written plugin, an example being a video plugin where you want to stream video from Kinesis. So you have that an Amplify CLI plugin for that. Moving on. As I talked about categories earlier for Amplify Framework, these are all of the categories that the Amplify CLI supports. So you have your auth, analytics, API, interactions category is if you want to design chatbots and use those in your front-end application. Then we have predictions, which is our AIML based use cases, and that's our focus for the webinar. Serverless functions, if you want to create Lambda functions. Remember earlier we talked about building full stack serverless app. So the entire infrastructure that Amplify CLI sets up is serverless. Then you have your storage, and then XR. XR category is your augmented reality, virtual reality use cases. So you can, in the back end, you can, if you want to use Sumerian powered apps or build Sumerian powered apps, XR is the category that you use. Now, let's move on to the usage. How does something like CLI, when we talk about these categories and abstraction, how does one actually end up using it? So in simplistic terms, it's a NPM package. So you do NPM install, and we'll do that here as we walk through the demo, but you do an NPM install for AWS Amplify /CLI. Once the NPM package is installed, you can easily add categories by using simple command from the terminal saying amplify add auth. That will add the auth category. Once you have added the category, you can also update the category saying amplify update auth, for example, and then you can modify the category that you have set up. Once you're done configuring all of the settings, and how do you configure? CLI will ask you just simple questions. And we'll see a live demo of that when we do the predictions, but it will ask you simple questions that you have to answer. And most of the times a default answer is provided. So based on your input, then it will switch the questions. And then it translates those to eventually a CloudFormation stack, and then that gets pushed to the AWS cloud. And then the Amplify push command is the one that actually will push and create the backend resources. Some of the other commands are Amplify remove auth if you want to remove a category, completely possible. And then Amplify delete, really helpful if you want to completely clean up the backend resources. Go to your app project, just run Amplify delete, and it will take care of deleting all of the backend resources that you may have set up. And this can be really nice because if you've ever built a mobile or web application by going to AWS and integrating multiple services, you would have felt that you are tackling a lot of pieces and you have to be a little careful on when you have to when you no longer read those resources. So also some other commands that are related to multiple environments. Multiple environments works as a GitHub-based workflow. So you can use GitHub-style commands where you say checkout, those are the same type of Git commands that you can use for your environment, where you say amplify environment checkout, amplify environment remove, amplify environment add. I'll point you to the documentation on this. There's a really nice high-level concept picture that explains it. For the purpose of this discussion, I'm going to stick to one development environment here, but it's really easy to create a separate environment, which I'll show you. Now, so we covered the CLI. I'll quickly go through the libraries and really get onto the good part of building that app. So what is the client library? So we covered the backend setting piece. Now we need the piece that you can use in your front-end applications to call your backend and connect to it. So the client libraries help you connect and interact with cloud services from your app. We support different types of platforms, which is web, iOS, and Android. And if you're working for web, then we support different JavaScript frameworks such as React Native, React, Angular, Vue, and Ionic. And again, client libraries are category-based, which means your libraries are based on the categories that we earlier listed, let's say storage, auth, API. So again, the libraries are use case-based, divided into categories. And some of the, if you see the diagram on the right-hand side, some of the services that you can interact from the cloud services are AppSync, Dynamo, Storage, Cognito, Amazon Cognito. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. A category may end up using one or more cloud services, depending on what is the use case that you're trying to build. So as we already covered the categories, and we're going to again use the Amplify client libraries for prediction. Right now, predictions is available only for JavaScript. So we're going to build a web app today, but it's pretty easy to also incorporate AI/ML use cases into your mobile app for iOS and Android, and I'll touch on that, on how can you do that. On a high level, essentially, instead of having the higher level abstraction based on categories where you're saying, give me a AI/ML use case that converts text from one language to another, for example. You're going to use a underlying low-level SDK of an Amazon service that achieves the use case, such as Amazon Translate. So that's how you would go achieving it for the front end for iOS and Android. Whereas for web apps, you'll see how easy it is. You really don't have to think in terms of Amazon services. Now, how do you use those clients? Of course, we'll add these code and build it, but essentially it's again an npm package where you go into your app projects, do an npm install AWS Amplify, and then in your front-end application code, you say import, you name the category from AWS Amplify. So if I had to do like API and call a path on an API, all I would do is say import API from AWS Amplify. And to call my API, I'll actually do API get, my API name, and the path. That's literally the code that you use as far as your use case building goes. Now, so let's get to the AI/ML part for your web apps. So how are we going to achieve it? We're going to use the predictions category. Prediction categories enables you to easily add AI/ML use cases powered by your Amazon AI/ML services. So if you've ever seen the Amazon machine learning page, it's divided into two sections. One, it says AI services, which, as we covered in the start, the distinction between the two services are more are focused towards achieving or simulating a natural intelligence, or to solve a problem, such as translating text, generating speech, recognizing entities in an image. Whereas ML services are, if you want to build a custom model on your own from scratch, you can use services such as SageMaker. SageMaker also does a wonderful job of providing you with already boilerplate code and notebooks that you can use to get started up and running, and build models on those, and then provide data to it to make it reach a point where it reaches your prediction accuracies. And of course, you don't need any machine learning experience to use the predictions category. If you've never done AI/ML ever, there's really you don't need to learn any new concepts. And in Amplify today, the support for SageMaker is through you providing a SageMaker endpoint. So if you already have a SageMaker endpoint, you can provide that in the CLI, and then make an API call to that SageMaker, to the hosted model in SageMaker, and then you're able to make inference that way. Another point I would like to add is SageMaker also provides a marketplace. So I'll show you the link for that as we build this app, but you can go to the SageMaker console, go inside their console, and then have and browse the marketplace for already pre-existing pre-trained model on which you can make a REST API call and get data. So one of the examples could be vehicle inspection data. So insurance companies that would want to speed up their operational efficiency by minimizing the time that they need to classify images, you can get a custom model for that, and I'll show you how to find it. But essentially, you don't have to build those models, and you can train them further if you want, but you can use those models as a starting point. So let's build that app. So how do we go about building this app? It's going to be simply 4 steps, and the good part is all of the things that I'm showing you here It's already documented on AWS mobile channel. And then I have the link here. So when you I have the slides, you'll obviously be able to go there and pick up the stuff if you don't want to listen to the long video. So that's one way. On a high level, we're just going to do 4 steps. Set up the backend using the CLI. We're going to then install the predictions library and integrate it into our front-end code. We're going to test it locally, and then we'll deploy and host the app using S3. And then I'll also show you how to achieve this using the AWS Amplify Console. So let's get started. So I'm going to switch to my terminal here. I am inside a folder here called Webinar Predictions. And I already have the CLI installed. Just for saving us a little time for the installation piece, I've already installed it. So what do I do next? So here, I'll just show you the link here so that we can follow it along. So the first step I'm going to do is I'm going to create a React app. So essentially, we're going to build a React web app. And I'm just going to create, I'm going to use the create React app command from npx, and I'm just going to say, my cool app. And what that's going to do is it's going to, if you've never used this command, really nice, provides all the boilerplate code that you need for a React app and gets you up and running really quick. For me, I was always an Android and iOS developer, but when I discovered this, JavaScript became altogether a different fun land for me. So once that's downloaded and set up, what we want to do is all of our Amplify commands that we'll be running, we have to run from inside the application folder. So if I go in here, we've already done the CLI installation, so I don't have to install that. But I'll show you the Amplify configure piece. So if I go inside my cool app and then do Amplify configure, what it's going to do it's going to ask you for your region and try and create an IAM user for you. So here you see it, as soon as I ran that command, it opened the AWS Management Console. So I'm already signed in because that's why it opened the web page for me. I was already signed in. If you're not signed in, it will just show you the login page. Then I say continue. It will ask you for the region. So I'm going to use my US East 1. Then it's going to give you a username to create a new IAM user. So I'm going to go with the default name that's ending in HN4. So what it does is it opens the IAM management portal and creates a username that was showing me with giving it programmatic access. So for the flexibility of this demo, it by default selects administrative access. Of course, you should be cognizant of the fact if you don't want to create a user with admin access, you should select the relevant permission level. But for the purpose of this demo, I'm just going to do the admin access. That's the default one. And once it's done, I'm going to say create user. Of course, I have my access and secret key that I'll use later. So if I say enter, it will ask me for my access key. I'm going to use that. And for my secret key, I'm going to take that and then copy and paste it here. Once it's done that, it's going to say what is the profile name that I want to associate it with that. So once that's done, I'm going to go with the default name. Okay, so I have done the configure step. Let's go back here. Now what I want to do is I want to initialize my project. So I do amplify init. So I'm inside my app project and I'm going to do amplify init. Now it's going to ask me for the name of the project. So see, this is the flow where I was talking about, where CLI will ask you simple questions and you keep answering them. So you say name of the project, my cool app, enter a name for the environment. So I'm going to call it dev as we decided. Then it will ask you for a default code editor. This is useful for, let's say you're trying to add some code snippet, or let's say you're trying to add serverless functions like Lambda function. Choosing a default editor will help CLI interact with you or get your input whenever an editor is required. Like if you want to modify a serverless function, or if you want to modify some CloudFormation stack, it's going to help. Having the editor helps you. So I'm going to just select Visual Code Studio. It detected that it's JavaScript because I'm inside the React app, and you can see it also detected the framework. So I select that. Then I'm going to say, yes, that's my source directory. Build is my default build directory. That's the build command. That's the start command. Done. So once that's done, and then it will ask me for my profile, which if you remember, we created a default profile. So I'm going to just pick that. So if you see here, it says using default provider CloudFormation. What that means is underneath the covers now, CLI is going and initializing your project and creating the corresponding auth roles. It's creating the deployment buckets in S3 that it would need for your app to run and deploy once we are done building it. So while this initialization is taking place, this is a first time a new project, so it does take a few seconds here. So while that's happening, let me show you the GitHub repos, where earlier I was saying that we are completely open source, and where can you find all of the Amplify related stuff. So there's when you go to github.com/AWS Amplify, you'll find all of the repos here where you have the JavaScript, iOS, Android, CLI. We also have all our docs open sourced. And there's a really nice community website. So if you're looking for resources, if you want to see what other people are building, how is Amplify being used, you can go to a community website that we have built, and that community website is aws.amplify/community. It's also present on the docs link, so if you click on this community, it will also open that. And you can see that it shows you there's a lot of posts on different topics out here. If you are a React developer, you can just filter it from here and look for our AIML related posts here. You can see cool image recognition demos on the live streaming video. So the community is really helpful. And we encourage people to look at these, consume those samples, and give us feedback and build it for, and build their apps. So here, going back, the init has completed. So now if I go back here, so we've done the init. Now what do we want to do? Now we come to the fun part. We want to add predictions. So I'm going to clear the screen here, and I'm going to say Amplify, add predictions. And what I'm telling Amplify is add a backend for predictions. I want to use predictions. So once it says that, it will ask me what type of use case do you want to see. So if you see here, it didn't ask me for the AWS service, or it didn't ask me another thing. All it's asking is tell me the use case that you're trying to solve. So for this webinar, let's say we will try to add text translation. So we're going to translate text from one language to another, and then we're going to take the output of that translation and have a speech generation. So you can imagine you can build a mobile app. If you're going somewhere, you're typing it in English. Let's say you're going to a country where Spanish is the language. So you type it in English, it converts it to Spanish, and then that input is fed into the other piece of the app, and what you get is a spoken Spanish word for or sentence for the input that you gave it. So I'm going to use convert, and convert is basically I'm trying to convert language from one source language to another. So if you see, it's asked me for authentication. It says you need to add auth to your project in order to add storage. So I'm going to say yes, because I need to make sure that I have the correct authorization and authentication applied to the resources that I'm going to create in this case. So I'm just going to go with the default configuration. I'm going to choose the username, and I'm done. Once it does the auth setting, it's going to tell me and ask me about the convert. So I'm going to say translate text into a different language. Yes, that's what I want. It's going to ask me, give me a friendly name. I can use the one that's default, but I'm going to just say translate my text resource, or I'm just going to call it that. And then I'm going to say, what is my source language? So my source language is English, and I want to translate, let's say, to Spanish. So I'm going to say Spanish. And then it's going to ask me who should have access, auth only or auth and guest users. So I want to have access for both auth and unauthenticated users. So I'm going to do that. Now, if you see, if I do an amplify status, see that it added the auth category and predictions. The operation was created. It hasn't pushed anything, so it doesn't show me that. So we added the backend here locally right now for converting the text. Now let's add the backend for generating speech from the text. So I'll say amplify add predictions. I'll say convert again, and I'll say generate speech audio from text. So that's what we want. So again, it will ask me for a name. So I'll say speech generator resource, and I'll say enter. Once it's done with that, it's going to ask me what is the source language. So since my output from the previous one is Spanish, I'm going to choose Spanish. Let's see if we can find it here. Mexican Spanish, let's pick that. And then it will pick me, this is a neat thing, it will pick a speaker here for you. Where is it pulling it from? So we have different, so all of these categories are powered by different Amazon AIML services. So this is picking it up from Poly, where Poly is the underlying service that's powering generation of speech from text. So Mia is a female supported speaker when you have something to be spoken in Mexican Spanish. So I'm going to choose that one. And I'm going to say, yes, I want it for both auth and guest users. Once I'm done with that, let's go back here. So we added text translation, we added speech to text to speech. Now we're going to say we want to push these changes. So if you remember anything from the slide from Amplify CLI, I have it all locally. Now it's going to tell me, yes, I created these resources. Do you want to continue? I'm going to say yes. So what it's going to do now is, again, the same exercise of taking the user input that you create, translating those to policies, roles, and underlying resources that may be needed for you to accomplish this use case. And then it's going to create the corresponding cloud formation stacks and then going to push it. So while this push is taking place, let's take a look at some other things here. So where do you find the AWS Amplify documentation? So as I said, the documentation lives on GitHub completely. So our official website is AWS Amplify GitHub.io/docs. It's also accessible from the AWS Amplify marketing page on AWS console, but that's the site where it lives. Now, if you want to see where predictions documentation lives, that's under JavaScript, under here docs. As I said, it's only supported for web right now. And then on the left-hand side here, we have all the categories that we select. So you can see on a high level, you have the CLI, you also have the categories, and then you have the framework support, the UI components that I was talking about. So giving you an example of the UI components, the authenticator component that I was talking about. So this is something like an authentication. So you can already have an out-of-the-box authenticator component that's already powered by Amazon Cognito, and you don't need to build all of this functionality. So that's one example where you have a sign in and sign up already configured for you. The predictions, let's look at predictions. So if I go to predictions here, what are the use cases that are supported? So I did talk about powered by AI ML services, but what are the core use cases that are supported with predictions? So, we saw that in the CLI, I talked about it in the libraries, but these are the core use cases that are supported today. And so two of the things that we're already doing is translating text from one language to another and converting text to speech. So we're doing the two today. Then you can also do a variety of things with text recognition from image or entity recognition. And I'll also share an advanced use case that's present already in the article from where we are working off, where you can do an advanced use case where you're saying that let's say you have an entity recognition that you bought a new car, and it's a new car model, and you want your app to recognize that either car model or some other object that you bought. So you can upload an image for that, and the Amplify CLI will automatically set up the underlying infrastructure for you for you to train the model on the fly and then recognize that image or that object in the next round. So if I go back to this blog that we had, let me show you the underlying architecture. So it will be Amplify library uploads an image S3 somewhere that triggers that has a Lambda trigger on it. It sends us indexing request to Amazon Recognition, and Amazon Recognition is the entity image recognition model that's hosted on Amazon Recognition. It'll update its collection. So essentially, when you're just making a predictions.identify call, it's going to return you an answer saying whether it identifies or what's the result of your input. And you can do all of this setup with this already has in the CLI. You don't need to do all of these resource setup. It's really simple. By just answering a few questions, you can spin up the entire infrastructure really fast. So let's go and check on our push. Push is complete. So now we have pushed all of that. So what's our next step? Now we integrate these. Now we integrate the library code in the front end. So how do we do that? So if I go back, we'll first need to install the Amplify library. So if I go here and push, so I'm going to say npm install AWS Amplify inside my app. So once I do that, now all of your you don't have to install the whole thing. If you just needed just predictions, then you just do /predictions here, and it's going to only install that library. But for the purpose of this demo, since we also added auth, and we are doing predictions, and then there's S3 bucket, deployment buckets. So I'm just going to install everything so that it's easier. Now, while it's doing that, let's go ahead and edit our code. So here we have the code. Really small snippet of code and really simple to understand. So I'm just going to copy and then just go through it while it's doing that. Let me create a new tab here, and then I'll go to my folder, webinar predictions, and I'll say my cool app, and then I'll say code. source app.js. Okay, doesn't work like my code. So let's open code here. So once my Visual Studio Code editor is open, I'm gonna just set the default shell command and then go again. So source app.js. Once that is done, I'm just gonna copy and paste this code and I'll just walk you through it. So let's first see what's our condition of the installation. Still going on, okay. So let's walk through this code. So what's happening here? We are installing the AWS Amplify library. So that's what that line means. React, because this is a React app, so we are doing that. And I'm using hooks, the use state hook in React, and just for the input that we're going to take to translate text. So how's the app going to look? It's pretty simple. If I go down here, that's how our app is going to look. We have a text translation where you have in text input a button. We'll input the text here, translate it, and then take that text, put it here for speech generation, and then press the button and it's going to play the sound for us. So that's what the app is going to look like. So how do you achieve that? So we have in the app, we have two functions, text translation, text to speech. What does text translation do? If I go to text translation here, pretty simple. It has a use state hook for you to take the input first. So the text to translate, it's going to use that hook, that input text edit that you saw. Once you enter the input and press the state, then set text to translate, that's going to change. So essentially that's the input piece. Then the response is you saw the label beneath the input box, so that's the label that's going to set the response once the text is translated. So the translate function, if you see, it's a simple class where we're saying predictions. So we already have this predictions. If you see, the predictions is under AWS Amplify. And it's a plugin provider. So we're saying Amazon AI predictions provider. And why are we using this term provider? Essentially, the Amplify framework is a pluggable framework. So you can write code for other providers. It's Amazon AI is the default provider here, but you can write and power it with other AI providers. It's an open source framework. It has the open pluggable interface, so you can write those. But so that's what it does. And then you see this line that says import AWS config from exports. What is that? So instead of putting in the or spinning up the configuration for services through constructors and then setting the regions and endpoints, AWS Amplify manages it through a centralized configuration file called AWS export. So when you did the Amplify init and everything, it's going to create a file AWS exports. If I go back here and just do cat source show me AWS exports, you see it has all of the Cognito endpoints. It has my predictions convert region, the source and target languages that I do. So that's why I need this. So rather than me creating a constructor and passing all of this, the CLI took care of this. Now I'm adding the Amazon AI provider, predictions provider as a pluggable entity here, and then I'm saying configure, and that configure is going to pick up all of the configurations that you entered in the CLI and initialize the Amplify class. So predictions, you just say predictions.convert, and you add translate text, and you give it the source. By default, you see that even if you didn't add this language equals EN or target language, it already knows because you had entered that in the CLI. But it's good to highlight that in the code. And then the text to translate is whatever comes as input. Once the input is processed, all you're doing is saying, once the button is clicked, on click, you translate this text, and the set text function over here is nothing but this, which will return the result of the translate function. So click off a button called set text goes here. Here it picks up the result that's going to come from here. So that's what it is. As far as text translation, if you look at text to speech, exactly the same flow. Nothing really much changes apart from the fact that you need an audio stream to play this. So the same thing again here, you have your input for the text. When you click and when you enter the input and click on translate, it's going to go over here and then call predictions convert. It's going to give it the text that it needs to convert to, again, the target language as Spanish, Mexican Spanish, and the voice ID is already given here. And then once the result returns, that's what it inputs to the audio stream. And then that audio stream is played here. So on click, so when you have the play button, that it gets clicked, and then the play invokes the audio stream, and the audio stream plays whatever was generated from the response over here. Okay, So now that we have walked through the code, the blog that we have already walks through this in detail. So if you have any questions, please feel free to leave any comments over there, or we can cover those in the end also over here. So moving back to the code here. So this is already done. So what I need to do is the library is already installed. So all I'm going to do is run this locally. I'm going to say npm start, and let's see what happens here. So ideally, it should open my app over here, and I should be able to see and have the translation and the conversion to speech work here. So giving it some time here. There you go. So let's say I want to convert greetings and say translate. So as you saw, it converted it to Mexican Spanish. It says, what language is this? And I'm going to write it for generating speech to it. Now, I don't have the text to speech here, but the audio for this, but let's do play. If you run this demo, you'll see that the female speaker voice Mia will speak this in the regional dialect that you expect it to speak into. So we have selected Mexican Spanish, then you'll get that dialect and the pronunciation. So that's it. That's really how quickly we connected the entire thing locally. Now let me show you a cool thing. We built the app, we tested it locally. How do I deploy this and then start sharing with people? Really simple, just 2 lines actually. You say amplify add hosting. It's going to ask me, do you want to do it with S3 with HTTP or S3 with CloudFront? So if you have to do hosting, you have 2 options. You use the S3 route or you use the Amplify AWS Amplify Console route, and that is a completely managed service, so you don't have to manage all those buckets and everything. It will do all of those stuff for you. I'm just going to pick S3 here for the purpose of the demo. Real cool. So it's just going to ask me the hosting bucket name on S3. I'm going to go with the default name, what it gave me, index.html. I'm going to keep those both the same. And then if I go back to my blog, all it's going to say is I have to publish it. So if I do amplify publish, now this should actually create the website for me. So if I see yes, see the magic here, how easy it is. It's under 15 minutes, I think we might have started. We were able to build a app with text translation, speech generation, and host it for you to start sharing it. So while this goes through the publishing step, it's really quick, doesn't really take much time here, but we can visit some other aspects. So one of the other things was the SageMaker. So the CLI you saw an option in the CLI that says infer. Infer is, it will ask you for an Amazon SageMaker endpoint. And then you can provide it with a REST endpoint that you know for SageMaker, and then you can use those inside your front-end application. But what if you wanted a custom model that you may not want to build, but you want to see what models are out there, and none of these ones are serving your purpose? So if I go to the AWS SageMaker, so if I go to SageMaker console here, you'll notice that there's something called as models and models packages, right? So there's a link there that says AWS Marketplace. If I go in there, and going on back on the example that I was telling you about vehicle inspection, you'll already find that there's a model here that essentially classifies your vehicle images into multiple types. So, if your vehicle is was damaged, this model classifies those images as per car model type, saying what was the damage. It helps the adjusters form buckets and say what type of damage was it, how bad was it, and those kind of classifications. So the point being here that it's really easy to find a pre-populated SageMaker model if none of the use cases that you see out here or Amazon AI services are serving your use case. So you can easily go that route also. Now let's see here what's happening. So here, as you can see, it already created the hosting endpoint. It's compiling stuff, and it opened the endpoint for me. So under 15 minutes, we were able to run this and completely host my entire website here with this functionality. And if I just go again here and say, hello, everyone, and say translate, it's going to convert that again to Spanish. And of course, if you paste all of that and say text to speech, it's going to generate the audio. And of course, I can hear you, but I want you to go in and listen to those and tell me how do you find the whole experience. Okay, so this is done. What I want to show you next is how can you, if you had this app hosted, how would you use Amplify Console for hosting this entire thing? So I have a testing deploy the same app that we had here. I can go to the Amplify Console over here, and if I say connect app, You see here, I can provide the provider here. So I'm just going to say GitHub and continue. And then it's gonna, you would have, for the first time ever when you go in, you have to give it a GitHub authorization. So once you do that, it's gonna pick up all of your repositories. So it picks up my one repository. It also picks up your branch. So this is a powerful feature that you can work off feature branches here. So if you committed a line of code over here, it's automatically gonna give you a PR preview. It's also going to initiate a build, deploy, and host, and you'll also get a temporary link for the PR. So if you had a PR that's staged and you just want to look at it, how it works, you also have that support without actually having to merge it inside and then deploying it. So I just say next, and I'll keep the default options over here. So it will give you how do you want to deploy. So I'm just going to say yes, choose my dev environment. I'm just going to take the default build settings because really our app isn't that complicated. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to say deploy my front end. I say next and say save and deploy. So while that is working, all it's going to do is you'll see that it creates the stage of build, deploy, test, and then host the website. And this is going to give you a completely managed service, so you don't have to. You can easily link it to your buckets already. So you see provision, build, deploy. So as you update the GitHub branches, it's all wired in. You don't have to really manage these things. Okay, going back to the presentation while this runs. So we have the instructions over there. Some of the resources here, we already went through the Amplify docs. We went through the community. We also covered the repos. And I've also added the link for the AWS Marketplace where the pre-trained models are deployed that you can call using REST APIs. So that's it for this session today. If you want to stay connected, please feel free to reach out on GitHub. We also have an open chat Spectrum room on Amplify website. So if you go to our documentation, there's an open chat over here where you can log in and ask questions. And of course, GitHub resources is always, we always keep on top of that, and we operate 100% in open source. Please let us know in the questions if you have any use cases that you want to see. What are your initial impressions on this? How would you plan to use this? I'm really excited to hear what your feedback on this is and how you build this. We've had customers who've built some really exciting apps. The first time they've ever used any machine learning service. So I'm pretty excited by the potential customers bring with such type of a service. And I'll now open up the round for Q&A.